Now we're going to go over how we want to sub through the midline after we've gotten the ball to our offensive end. Now, we're going to act like we know how to control the ball in our offensive end in a 5-on-6 scenario, so we don't have to talk about, moving the ball, but understand that once we try to sub a player over the midline, we are going to be in a 5-on-6 scenario where the defense has the advantage. So if we don't move the ball or we can't run around quick enough, if we're lazy, they're going to be able to get a free double because we're pulling a player off of the field. Now, so we're just going to eliminate that fact from this and talk about the mechanics of subbing through the midline. So any sub through the midline is going to have 3 components. A defenseman will sub out for a midfielder. Here in our clear, we've already done that. D1's already off the field. M2 is now on the field. Then we're going to want to pull a midfielder for a defensive midfielder. So this is our defensive midfielder. We're going to want him to sub with our midfielder. So we are going to call Oscar, which means over the midline, and DM1 is going to come over the midline. And once he's over, M2 can come onto the offensive end. And now DM1 is not done until he goes all the way off the field, because that will allow us to either put our defenseman back on for the defensive midfielder. So our defensive midfielder comes off for a defenseman, or in this example, it's going to be our next sub, which is OM1. So now once OM1 goes on the field, now we're going to call DM2. DM2 is going to come over the midline, and then once he comes over the midline, OM1 can go on the field, and now DM2 is not done till he gets off of the field, and D1 can come onto the field, and now we are just set. We're into our offensive end. We should be good to go from there. Now, there's a lot of mechanics in how we might want to sub through the midline, like if we want to set a pick up top, if they're trying to match feet and marry and run over the midline with us, if we set a pick using the player that is coming off the field, the player defending that player is going to have to defend the switch, which means we could gain an advantage, and we'll go over that with video right now. In this clip, Hofstra's going to try and keep one of Hopkins' offensive midfielders on the defensive end by having this LSM set a pick and then run off the field. So Hofstra sets up a big dodge up top, the LSM comes out to set a pick, and now what would usually happen here is the player defending the picker is going to have to evaluate whether or not they're going to switch or stay, and it's going to make them show to the middle of the field, which should give the LSM a few yards advantage in getting to the midline. Now, in this particular situation, Hopkins shows from the crease to allow the offensive personnel to get a good jump and chase the LSM out through the midline, but overall, the LSM does get a nice step on the offensive personnel. Now we're going to set the picking subbing game aside and talk about how the 2-3-2 clear allows you to sub faster and show how we are going to be subbing through the midline. As we begin this clip, let's clarify where these players are going to go. This player is going to go off box over. This player is going to go off box midline. This will be our first sub, this will be our second sub, and this player is going to find himself in the middle of the field. Now, as the clear starts, we build our base with the goalie and the defenseman, and everybody moves up field. Our first sub happens, our second sub happens, and our second sub gets the ball. Now, as he runs the ball over the midline, we've already subbed 2 of our offensive players onto the field, and now we just have to buy time to get our last player onto the field. Notice how the final sub can come on the field once the defenseman subs out for them, because the off-box over player has gotten back on sides for them, and now the off-box over player will sub out so we can get the third defenseman back on the field. In this final clip of Penn State, we're going to show how we're going to sub all 3 players if we push all of our defensive personnel into the offensive end. Yale does a great job here riding and only gives up this pass to the pole at the center of the field. Now, they were probably wanting this because as the pole carries over, they press and try to take the ball with the LSM. The pole does a great job to run around. He actually has a nice little rocker here, almost takes a shot, and then passes up to a great matchup up top where Yale's pressure is no longer a factor. Now, the pole subs through the midline. The LSM subs through the box, and we get our first 2 offensive personnel on the field. The ball is passed to the offensive personnel, and we get our third sub through the box. Now, the only thing I have to make note of about this subbing pattern is that they did not go one at a time. Having the pole and the LSM sub at the same time can be risky if you're playing a team that likes to pressure a lot. But so the most important part is the fact that everybody understands the mechanic of subbing through the midline, which is defenseman for a midfielder that's going to be coming to the offensive end. Then the defensive midfielder that's in the offensive end needs to sub for the midfielder, the fresh midfielder through the midline. Then the defensive midfielder that's subbed over the midline needs to sub out for the original defenseman that subbed on for the fresh midfielder. Once people understand those three mechanics, subbing through the midline is a breeze. It just takes a little while for players to like really see it and visualize it happening.